Although the two largest navies on the planet, the British and the French, had teamed up to fight the Russians in the Crimean War in the early to mid-1850s, this hadn't prevented the time period before, during, or after the conflict also hosting one of several 19th century Anglo-French naval arms races. Although remaining generally the smaller navy, by absolute ship numbers, the French had managed to draw ahead in ship-of-the-line technology with the Napoleon, the first ship of the line purposely built with a steam engine. The British had then pulled ahead for sheer size with the 131-gun Duke of Wellington class, only for the French to quickly respond with the Britannia, a 130-gunner, but physically still larger. It was into this environment that the British ordered a new class of ships of the line. These would be the first, and as it turned out only, British three-deck first-rates to be ordered with steam power built in from the start. Although ever so slightly shorter than the Britannia, they were a little bit wider and therefore ended up displacing about 100 tons more, making them just the largest wooden battleships of the late 1850s. Although technically a wooden vessel, the two ships, the Victoria and the Howe, were approaching the very limits of what wooden capital ship design could actually accomplish, and so they had extensive iron bracing included in their hulls. Armament on paper seemed to be a little bit less than the Duke of Wellington class, with only 121 guns, but many of these were larger and more powerful. The default armament that the older class had been designed with was a uniform battery of various weights of 32-pounder gun, but the Victoria class was intended to have a lower and middle gun deck that was armed entirely with 8-inch shell guns. Although the same caliber as the 68-pounder that would become the standard Royal Navy armament over the next few years with the rise of ironclad warships, the 8-inch shell gun was significantly lighter than the 68-pounder, and thus it could only fire the lighter weight explosive shells. This is why in this period there's a mixture of guns being rated by weight of shot. These are generally the ones capable of firing solid shot as well as shells, and guns rated purely by caliber, which, at least until yet another naming system takes over, are generally capable of firing shells only, at least when you're looking at British ships and weapons. The 32-pounder, in case you're interested, was roughly speaking a 6-inch gun. The upper deck and the quarterdeck carried 32-pounder short-barreled cannons and carronades, and there was a single 68-pounder present as a chase gun on the upper deck. A lone 4,400 indicated horsepower steam engine supplied a lone screw propeller with power for a top speed of just under 12 knots when under steam. Although laid down in 1856, the ships would not launch until the end of the decade, just in time for the ironclad revolution, and this meant very different things for the two ships. Victoria was built in Portsmouth and went into reserves almost immediately upon commissioning, but she stayed there for the first half of the 1860s, avoiding being converted into an ironclad, briefly emerging in 1864 for a 3-year stint as the flagship of the Mediterranean Fleet, since almost all the ironclads were being retained at first for home defence purposes, as the French were building their own. With the advent of larger and heavier guns, by the time she went back into the reserves, she was carrying about 20 fewer than she'd emerged with, and she'd remain in the reserves for another quarter century, only being sold for breaking up in 1893. Howe, meanwhile, was built in Pembroke in Wales, but she was never commissioned as a warship. She went straight into deep reserve without her masts. Here she remained for 25 years. Then she was moved to Plymouth in 1885 and renamed Bulwark, her first role in the Royal Navy being that of a training ship. This lasted for about a year, and then she was toodled on slightly up the Tamar to Devonport, still as a training ship, but now part of the establishment of HMS Impregnable, which was another naval school, and thus she was renamed appropriately. At some point in the 1890s, she seemed to have been moved back down the Tamar to Plymouth, but kept the name Impregnable, which is a somewhat understandable move since at the time Devonport and Plymouth were two separate towns, but they were incredibly close to each other, as you might have guessed, on the River Tamar estuary. And indeed they, along with another town, East Stonehouse, would be amalgamated into the city of Plymouth in 1914. However, in 1919, the ship was renamed yet again, going back to Bulwark, but this would only last for a couple of years because she was then sold for breaking up in 1921.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.